everyone, it's Kris here. I did an interview with a retired homicide detective, and you're going to be listening to that episode now. I just wanted to warn you, there are trigger warnings. We talk about homicides, sexual assault, and all things related to crime. So if any of that is going to trigger you or affect you in any way, this might not be the episode for you. But if you do continue to listen, I hope you enjoy, and please give us your feedback. Thanks so much. Hey crafters, thanks for tuning in. This is Kris here. We have a special guest today. This is Bill. He is a retired homicide detective from Orange County, California, and we are going to be discussing his experience and his take on different cases in the media. I know you probably know this, but I am a huge true crime person. I think you had a lot to do with that because I met you when I was 16, and your stories about your investigations and your experiences really were intriguing to me, to the point where I wanted to go into the police department at one time. I don't know if you remember that. But you also gave me one of my first true crime books to read, and it was the Hillside Strangler book. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought it would be really interesting to hear your take on some stuff. So how do you feel about true crime being such a form of entertainment these days? I know some people think it's disturbing that we find interest in murder and these crazy people.
Well, I think the intrigue behind the huge audience that these people look at these true crime stories is because of the mystery involved, the intrigue, and them not knowing how the mechanics of a homicide actually happen. A murder is a very complicated crime. It's obviously the hardest crime to solve. It takes literally thousands and thousands of things that an investigator has to do to try to solve this crime. I take personal pride in this because I felt that I was the voice of the victim. The victim is dead. I felt that it was my responsibility, my duty, to try to bring this case to a conclusion. So my heart went into this. I was very passionate about this. It messed up my home life because of it, but it was just a calling that I had, and I really enjoyed it. It's very stressful, but people don't understand what makes a murder. How does it happen? Well, 85% of all murders that happen are committed by people that know the suspect. Example, families, husband kills a wife, wife kills a husband kills the family, brother kills brother, etc. Well, those are pretty easy to solve because once you find out the dynamics of the family and how they were interacting with one another and the problems that each family member has, it's pretty easy to figure that one out. The ones that are the most difficult are what we call whodunits. We find a body, mutilated, murdered, whatever, and we have to try to figure out why that person was killed. Those are the hard ones, because you start from the beginning. You start with the victim's past, the victim's present, and all the family members involved. Usually the key comes within the family. Someone in the family knows something. Unless it's a complete abduction off the street, where an example was a little girl got abducted off the street coming home from school. She was 6 years old. She just vanished. We had manhunts going out looking for her. It took 2 days before they found her body in a culvert along the Santa Ana River. She had been brutally sexually molested and strangled, and we didn't have any idea who committed it. There was a young investigator that came on to the unit, and he was inexperienced. So I tried to share with him some of my experience. I'd been working homicide for a number of years, and I told him, I asked him, I says, how thoroughly did you interview the family members. And he just kind of shrugged me off like, that's a very basic question. Yes, yes, I took care of it. I took care of it. Well, the case went unsolved for 20 years. He was never able to solve that case. Then a few years back, because of the recent DNA developments, evidence was submitted back to the DNA labs, and they were able to determine that her brother was the suspect in this case.
Wow.
He was contacted by cold case detectives, and he ended up confessing to the crime, which really, really pissed me off, because for 20 years, we could have known who the suspect was had that investigation been handled differently. And because of the arrogance of this young police detective, he felt that he was covering all his bases. And I purposely went to him at the beginning to ask him about the family members, and he kind of brushed me off.
Right.
Well, if he'd have been as thorough with the family members as I would have been, that case would have been solved immediately. So it's difficult. It's difficult from a homicide investigator's perspective to put all of these things together and come up with a successful conclusion. But there are crimes today, there's actually tens of thousands of homicides that have never been solved. Big agencies all over the world are forming these cold case units where other detectives come back and they look at these old cases again. And a lot of them have been solved lately, and that's mainly due to the DNA advances that we have today.
Well, with that DNA coming around, when you started, they didn't have DNA labs.
They did not.
So do you feel like there was a difference in the type of detectives you were back in the old days to detectives now?
Yeah, it's a whole new breed. It's a whole different approach now because of DNA. If we get a whodunit, but we get some evidence, like semen examples, or samples, I should say, they can submit those to these labs, and the database for these labs is huge.
Right.
So even if they don't have the suspect's DNA in there, they have a family member's DNA in there, and they're able to link it that way. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's a lot easier now. It's still a lot of work because it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get these DNA lab results back from the DNA.
Wow.
Not like they show on TV where a homicide is committed, then the detective goes into the station and the assistant says, hey, well, we got the DNA evidence and the fingerprint evidence from the suspect. That's bullshit. It takes a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks to get a DNA examined in the labs.
But that's quick compared to what it used to be, correct? Didn't it take months to come back?
Well, like I say, we've still got tens of thousands of bodies out there that have never been solved. And some of those, the DNA wasn't sufficient to submit to the labs, so those will remain open.
Okay.
My only hope when I was working those kind of cases was that the suspect would become a braggart. He'd be sitting in a bar and he'd casually strike up a conversation with another patron, and somehow it would slip about, he'd start talking about this homicide that he committed. And then that good citizen would come forward and say, hey, I was talking to John Brown the other day and he told me a little bit about this case. What do you know about it? Well, that's a big step.
Right.
That's a big move forward. Now we have some place to go to with that, But those cases in today's society are few and far between.
Right.
People just don't want to get involved.
Right. I was just listening to an episode of a true crime case, and a gentleman said that he was walking by a house and heard screaming, and yet he didn't do anything about it. What advice do you have for people? I know people are leery of just calling the police every time they have a feeling or hear something. But as a police officer, do you just recommend any type of noise or something? If they have a suspicion about something or something seems unusual, or, what is your advice for the average person?
Well, there's a new saying going around now that's very prevalent in our communities where it says, if you see something, say something. I believe in that.
Right.
I'll give you an example. I had a homicide that occurred in a trailer park And these mobile homes were positioned off at an angle, so they weren't a true square to one another. They were like at a 45-degree angle. Well, this one family was living in one mobile home, and their living room was opposite the kitchen of the mobile home next door. Well, they heard the guy inside the mobile home. He was screaming for help. Help me, help me. Somebody call the police. Help me, help me. These people ignored that.
Oh my.
He went on for about half hour asking for help, and nobody responded. This family did nothing. The guy ultimately ended up dying because of his injuries. Had that family have stepped forward and picked up the phone and said, hey, I hear the guy next door, he's screaming for help. You know, I don't know what to do. We probably could have saved his life.
Right.
But because this family said nothing, I was so embarrassed for them that I chastised them for their lack of getting involved in something like this. They could have saved that man's life.
For sure.
So yes, I'm a big proponent now of if you see something or if you hear something, say something.
Okay.
Pick up the phone. Don't be afraid. The police will take all your phone calls. They'll direct them wherever they need to be. Sometimes it could be nothing, but sometimes it could be a life-saving situation.
Okay. Going back to the DNA, I wanted to get your opinion. What is your opinion as far as, do you believe that it's a good idea that everybody submit DNA to some kind of bank or, a system, so that when the police are looking for a suspect, they get a hit right away? Because from what I understand, the DNA is usually from felons that is it true that they commit a felony that they put their DNA in a system, CODIS or something?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so if you have not committed a felony, then your DNA will not be in the system?
Not necessarily. It has to do with medical conditions. If you go to your doctor and he takes a nose swab, chances are he could submit that to the DNA database.
Without us knowing?
No, you usually have to sign a permission slip to do that.
Okay.
But in today's society, I mean, we can't even get people to get vaccinated for the COVID.
Right.
How willing are people going to be to submit their DNA to put in a data bank?
Definitely, but do you think that it should be mandatory?
Personally, yes, I do believe that. But like I'm saying, this is a free society, and I don't think the government should demand that we put restrictions or impulsions on people arbitrarily just because it's the law.
Okay. All right, so let's go on to serial killers. What was the most impactful serial killer, or were you most intrigued by?
It happened in Los Angeles back in I think it was the 70s. They were called the Hillside Stranglers. That one really engrossed me because of the uniqueness of the crime that they were committing. They were abducting girls off the street. It was two cousins, taking them back to one of the cousins' home where they would repeatedly rape them and choke them into unconsciousness. And that was what got them off. That was their thrill. Mm-hmm. Until they would strangle them to the point where they would ultimately die while in a sexual position. Mm-hmm. And then they would have to dispose of the bodies. They would just roll it off the freeway bank somewhere in Los Angeles. These bodies were scattered all over the Los Angeles countryside. These people, these two cousins, felt that the heat was getting too hot for them, so they decided to stop doing this. So they split up. One of them moved to Washington, where he was a security officer at a college, a community college up in Washington. Well, he remembered all this excitement that he used to get while committing these homicides. So he by himself went out and abducted a girl and repeated the whole incident all over again. He'd strangle them, choke them, and then he'd dump the girl off the side of the freeway. Luckily, the Washington police officers that were working that homicide saw the similarities between their homicide and the Hillside Strangler homicides. So they got together with Los Angeles Police Department, and they were able to solve that crime, and they arrested both of these cousins. One of them is still in custody. I believe the other one died while in prison.
Right.
So that was kind of a lucky break for us for that one. But that one intrigued me because I couldn't believe how somebody could be so cold as to repeatedly rape a woman and then just dump her body like trash along the side of the freeway, you know.
And they would torture these women. Like one of them, I remember that they injected Windex into her.
Yes.
You know, in a vein. I mean, that's
just to see
they were
the
sick.
reaction. Yeah.
They were very sick. Yeah, I'll never forget that story at all. And it was funny because I just watched a show called City of Angels, City of Death, I think it's called. Yeah, on Hulu. And it was talking about there were so many serial killers like in the 70s and 80s in Los Angeles. At one time they had like 7 different serial killers. That must have been a really crazy time. I know you didn't work at in the LA area, but you were close. So did you guys notice an increase in Orange County in homicides? And did you think maybe they were contributing, the ones in LA were somehow coming to Orange County?
Serial killers, they don't have any jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. They don't say, oh, well, I'm leaving Los Angeles County now, I better be careful. No.
Right.
They'll just commit the crime whenever the urge strikes them. There was another homicide. It was Randy Kraft was his name. He was killing, he was a homosexual, so he was killing young boys, young men. And he got caught because he had picked up this Marine in San Clemente, took him to his home, did whatever he did to him, and then he killed him. Mm-hmm. He put him in his car and he was traveling north on the 5 freeway, and he was stopped in Orange County by the Highway Patrol. Highway Patrol officer saw that his passenger was non-responsive, obviously because he was dead.
Right.
So he questioned Randy Kraft about it until the officer went over and tried to wake this guy up. Turned out he was dead. Mm-hmm. So he obviously arrested him, and he'd committed so many murders, and he delayed his trial so long that he was in the Orange County jail for 5 years.
Really?
Before he went to trial. He was convicted of most of the homicides. Mm-hmm. And I think he also died in prison.
Mm. Wow.
But that one came close to us here in Orange County.
Right.
That one in Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
The Night Stalker, yeah.
He killed a woman down in South County, and he was eventually found. But he committed homicides all throughout the Inland Empire, Los Angeles counties and stuff.
Right. I was a kid when that happened, and I remember we were so scared. And I cut out his picture from the newspaper and had it on my little desk with it covered. But I was just so scared, but also enthralled by this man that had everybody just terrified. Like, how does one person do that? You know? But I think my most, I don't know how to really say it, but I'm not my favorite serial killer, but the one that I find the most interesting is the Zodiac killer, because he's never been found. And he wore his costume, and he sent letters to the newspapers, and I don't know why, but just like you with the Hillside Stranglers, he's the one that intrigues me the most.
I had a little portion of the Zodiac murders. These were happening in San Francisco, and I had a lot of contacts with the San Francisco Police Department. So a lieutenant from there called and asked me if I would go try to locate a witness that had been a victim of the Zodiac killer. This victim was living in Riverside at the time, and they asked if I would see if I could find her and get her statement and maybe have her come forward to the San Francisco Police Department. Well, this had been, some time had passed, and I went to Riverside, and I tried searching for this girl, but she just vanished. She was gone from the area. I never was able to contact her.
Yeah, I remember I've watched a few series about, or films or whatever, TV shows about the Zodiac, and how there is a correlation to Riverside and a student that went to Riverside College, but I guess they ruled that guy out.
Yeah, that one never came to fruition. They didn't have enough evidence to say it was him. But that was the part of the Zodiac that they wanted me to get involved in, see if I could locate one of these college students that apparently knew this victim, and they thought that maybe she could provide some more information, but I could never find her.
Okay. So you've been retired for almost 20 years now.
The 1st of April will be 20 years.
Wow. Do you miss working?
No.
No?
Not one moment of it. I had enough.
Yeah, it was too stressful.
No, it's just, it was time to give it up to the young guns. Just time to move on.
Right. You know, I work in the operating room, and I've kind of been desensitized to surgery and seeing things that the normal person wouldn't like to see. Do you feel that because you have seen so many dead bodies and worked so many homicides, do you ever feel like you were a little desensitized in a way, not in a bad way to where you didn't care, but to what you saw? Did you become desensitized?
Well, you have to be. What you see, what you hear, what you smell, some of the most hideous smells there are is a dead body. You get desensitized to that, but you don't get desensitized to the passion you have to bring that case to a conclusion. I didn't anyhow. Yes, a lot of people get burned out in their jobs and they just go through the motions every day. Fortunately for me, I was not that way. I have a lot of compassion. I have a lot of empathy for people, and especially people that have been murdered by some deranged individual. I felt that I was the only voice that victim had in trying to bring her case to a conclusion.
Okay.
So no, I did not get desensitized to the feelings, to the emotions involved in working a homicide.
Okay. I've watched Mindhunter. Have you seen Mindhunter?
Who?
Mindhunter. It's a TV show, and basically it's about how they came up with profiling. Now, you were a detective at that time. How did profiling come into how you did your job?
I'm not a big advocate because I had personal experience with an FBI agent that was a profiler, and every incident that he had where he was trying to profile, it was very generic. They were always male, they were always white, they were always between 30 and 40, they were always come from a split home, they were all the same.
Okay.
I mean, that fits a lot of people in our population, I understand that, and that's very true that these people are that way, but it gave me no information. How many male whites, 30 to 40, come from broken families, are there living in the world?
For sure, right. You also worked with the FBI at times.
Yes.
And how did that differ from working as a homicide detective?
Well, I worked with the FBI in a different facet of police work. It had nothing to do with homicides. I worked with them when I was bank robbery investigator. I worked with them with the elderly crimes. So the question you're asking is in relation to homicides?
Well, I guess because it wasn't a homicide, you were working different areas. But do you find that they work in different ways than a regular police officer or detective versus FBI?
The FBI is an entity all to themselves. And I've said it 20 years ago and I'll say it today. The FBI is still being run by J. Edgar Hoover. Nobody makes a move in that agency without consulting Washington, D.C. first.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. I was working elderly crimes where the suspects would call the victims, elderly victims, and try to get money out of them. Giving them some false story about they won the lottery in the state of Utah and they won $12 million, but they'd have to surrender $62,000 in taxes before they could get this money. Well, we had one case where the suspect was calling this victim down in Emerald Bay in Newport Beach. And I wanted to put a phone trap on the victim's phone so that I could catch this guy's conversation and catch his voice, maybe give me some indication of where he was. So the FBI agent that I was with said, no, he goes, we got to submit this to the Washington first before we can get permission to tap their phone. And I said, well, I don't work for the FBI. I work for my agency, and we don't need permission from Washington. So I went down and I put a trap on the victim's phone. I was able to trap 4 phone calls that ultimately led me to this guy's arrest. After I had him in custody, the FBI agent told me, he says, okay, we got permission to set a trap on this victim's phone. This was like 2 weeks later.
Right.
So yes, they do operate
Okay.
a lot differently.
Okay.
This one agent that I was working with, he'd been an FBI agent for over 13 years. The city that I was working with, I would work anywhere from 30 to 60 cases a month. And I asked him, I says, being an FBI agent, how many cases do you work a month? And he says, what are you talking about? How many open cases do you have right now? And he said, I have 1.
Wow.
I said, how long have you had this case? And he said, over a year.
Wow.
I said, you've been working this one case for over a year and it's still open? He said, yeah, that's just the way it works here, you know.
That's crazy.
So they have a different mindset.
Right.
Than we do in municipal or county or state
Wow.
Police agencies.
How many different areas have you worked in your career? Homicide, robbery?
Out of the 30 years I was there, I worked 20 years as an investigator, a detective. And I'd work, my first detective job was as a bicycle theft investigator.
Did you get teased?
Yes, I did. But that's where you had to start.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll say one thing from when I got there, there was 120 bicycles being stolen every month in the city I was working in. When I left there, I had that down to 30
Wow.
bicycles a month being stolen. Because I was just persevering these, you know. I figured out how I was going to catch these guys.
Right.
And back in those days, it was mainly drug addicts that were stealing a bicycle. They'd turn around and sell it for $10 and get $10 worth of smack.
Okay.
Well, I started following these narcotics addicts, and I'd stake out in their house. They'd leave early in the morning. I'd follow them. I'd follow them to a junior high school or a high school that was there. I'd see him steal the bike. I'd see him take it to the extreme opposite end of the city where he would sell it to his connect.
Yeah.
And he would score his dough. So I watched him do this 3 or 4 times until I was able to get a search warrant and an arrest warrant for him, and then it would stop. So that's where I started my career. But then I worked auto theft. I worked miscellaneous theft, all thefts that don't fall under a certain category. I worked sex crimes. I worked robberies. I worked bank robberies. And then homicide.
And that's where you retired from?
No, I retired as a bank robbery investigator.
Oh, okay.
I left the police department at a certain time because I was frustrated in my job. I was being held back by my administration. I was being held back by the Orange County District Attorney's Office, where they wanted to reenact the whole case before they would file a complaint against a guy. And that gets pretty frustrating where you've spent 10,000 hours working a case. Now you've got to spend another 4 or 5 hours explaining it to the district attorney before he'll issue a complaint. So I got frustrated and I left. I came back 7 years later, had to start all over again. And then I got asked to come back to homicide on 4 separate occasions, and I declined. I was much happier working street crimes than I was working homicides because it was just a lot of work, a lot of hours, and I didn't want to mess up my second marriage by being gone so long.
Okay.
So I retired as a bank robbery investigator.
Okay. Well, I think this has been really interesting, and I think our viewers are going to find this interesting. So thank you so much for answering my questions and giving us all this insight. I appreciate it.
Thank you for asking. It's a pleasure talking to you.
You too. All right, crafters, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.